Hello and welcome to another edition of Active Living. We have a reversal of roles today with George Sennett as our traveling man. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay. You've just completed a very interesting trip and unique trip to Europe. So let me ask you, how did this whole trip evolve?
Well, we have a group of friends that like to bike, and so we decided that we've done several tours around the United States, but we thought we'd like to do something in Europe. So we hooked up with a company called VBT,
Okay.
or Vermont Biking, and we use them as a company to help us plan this tour. And this is a little bit unique because we combined biking along with being on a barge.
A barge?
Yeah, a barge. And I got to tell you a little bit about the barge.
Okay.
This lady decided there would be an opportunity to take a barge and convert it more into a luxury barge rather than ferrying materials up and down the river.
Right.
So she converted it so that it would have 24 stateroom. It would hold 12 staterooms for 24 people, and it had a wonderful lounge area as well as a beautiful area that you could have. You could sit there and have dinner and in style. You'd have your own chef, and so it was a first-class conversion. The lady who owned the barge happened to be the captain of the barge.
Oh my goodness.
So we had an opportunity to talk to her and even get up in the bridge and help her to navigate, so to speak.
At a very slow pace.
Yeah, right. So anyway, we had a great an opportunity to bike. Actually, what we did is we selected this one area of Europe called the Mosel River.
Oh, yes.
And the Mosel River runs, actually it originates somewhere in Switzerland, I believe. But anyway, it runs through France and it runs through Germany, and it kind of comes up next to Luxembourg.
So these were the three countries you actually bicycled through.
So we started through in Germany, we ended up in France, and we kind of brushed up against Luxembourg.
Okay.
So it was a terrific tour.
Fantastic.
The Mosel Valley really is known for the grapes that it grows.
Okay.
And it's an unbelievable number of vineyards along the river, and probably some of the steepest vineyards you've ever seen in your life. They're almost vertical.
It's vertical?
Yeah. And they grow some of the best grapes for white wine there.
So you had what, 24 people went on this trip then, with men and men and the wives?
We did.
Okay.
We did. And actually we filled up the barge with our friends. So we didn't have any strangers on the barge. It was all friends and friends of friends, which is one of the unique trips that they said they've had, because normally there's a lot of strangers that are on these trips.
Yes.
But it worked out really well. We had, like I said, we have 24 people. And the second night, what they did is they bussed us to our starting point, which is a town of Kokum. And Kokum is probably located about maybe 30 miles from the intersection of the Rhine River and the Mosel River. And there, we couldn't get on the barge until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so we had a tour of Kokum, which included a really interesting tour of a castle. You know, castles all over the place in Europe. This is one of the better preserved castles, and it's called a Reichsburg Castle, or Reichsburg, R-E-I-C-H-B-U-R-G, Reichsburg Castle. And so we toured the Reichsburg Castle, which was absolutely fantastic. It was built around the year 1000.
Oh.
And they still have a lot of the period furniture that was there. So we toured the castle, and from the castle, which was high on this hill, we had a great view of our barge, which was sitting down the river.
Great.
And we toured the city, and then after that, we walked to the barge, and we had a kind of a orientation, and then they said, okay guys, get your biking clothes on, we're going to do your first ride. And your first ride is going to be a warm-up ride. It's going to be about 8 or 9 miles. So we start riding along, we get on our bikes, and they give us all the safety talk and all that stuff. We get on our bikes and we start riding, and I'm out of town about 3 miles. We come up to this little town, and what don't you know, there is a German festival going on.
Oh,
It's a wine
fortunate.
festival going on,
Geez.
and there's a oompa band there.
That's right.
So we had an opportunity to stop, and since it was a wine festival, obviously we had to sample the wines.
Oh, absolutely.
So we sampled 3 or 4 of the wines. They were pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we had a great time. We just sat there for an hour or so, listened to the music, and then we continued biking on down to the barge. I would say most of the women biked. There were 3 or 4 that did not. Mm-hmm. And they had an option of, you know, they could just, when the barge was docked at a town, mm-hmm. they would tour the town. Or they could stay on the barge, and it was pretty comfortable. I mean, they had an opportunity to sit out in the sun if they wanted to. They could be in the shade. They could be in the lounge, mm-hmm. you know, and so, or in their room, whatever they wanted to do. And the rooms, I got to say, were fairly good size for a barge, right? And even had a full-size shower for a ship. Excellent. Or a barge. That's a little unusual. Normally, you got this little tiny thing
right.
you got to
squeeze in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was really good. So I can't say enough about the planning of the trip by Vermont Biking was just incredible. I mean, you knew exactly what time you're going to leave the barge, and you do a tour of anywhere from 10 to 40 miles, mm-hmm. and you arrived at your next location, and the barge would be there to meet you. So it was kind of, you kind of worked your way up the Mosel River, which was really kind of interesting.
So that, in describing that, what was a typical day as you had breakfast on the barge, and then maybe once at that point there, you got on the bicycles like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning when you started, and then? Well,
basically what you do is you'd have breakfast, and it was a typical European type breakfast, and it was by the way, we had our own chef on board.
Oh,
and so it was
wow.
a typical European type breakfast, which was basically kind of a buffet type of thing. Mm-hmm. But the evening meals were unbelievable. He came out in the morning and said, now, we have 2 or 3 choices for dinner. Which one would you like? You know,
okay.
And gave you that. So you had absolutely first-class food on the ship. But anyway, the typical day was we'd start, we'd have breakfast about 8. We'd bike about 9:30. Mm-hmm. And we could bike, as I said, anywhere between 10 and 40 miles. And you had choices each day as to how far you wanted to bike. For example, on the Sunday, which is the first day, real full day, we had 17. You could do 17 miles or 30 miles.
Now, is there like one tour guide that leads you, or a couple? Because if you only did the half of it or partial, then
well, that's the other good thing. You know, the other good thing about this is Vermont Biking provides 2 guides. One guy is riding with the group, mm-hmm. so that hopefully you don't make any mistakes and end up somewhere you shouldn't be.
Right.
And the second guy would be in a van. So after you're out riding for about an hour, you'd notice this van sitting along the side of the road. He'd have a table out there with a tablecloth on it.
Don't tell me.
He'd have all kinds of fruit and vegetables laid out so that you could have your mid-morning snack. And so that was really great.
That's cool.
Yeah. We had one day, it was about 40 miles. They took a shuttle and shuttled us up into this town way away from the river. And we rode back down on an old railroad track. And there was one section, I think it was about 5 miles long, you'd never pedaled.
Is that right?
We were going downhill the whole way, which is this Mosel River Valley. And we ended up on the second day in this town called Zell, Z-E-L-L, and it's one of the largest wine-producing communities on the river. It's huge, and the town next to it, Trebin-Trierbach, was the world's second largest trading center for wine.
Oh,
so it's huge wine area.
So France gets all the publicity, but then you have this great winery in Germany that
white wine is their thing.
Is their thing?
Yeah. There's an area there produces some of the best wine. It's called Zeller Schwarze Katz. It was called Black Cat wine. We had an evening on the barge after we had dinner. The captain gave us a tour of the pilot house and told us about all this, you know, the way that they navigate and all that type of stuff. And then, so you know, it was a very informative tour. In addition to that, we had one day we had a wine tasting event
On the boat?
No, we actually went to a went to a winery, and the winery had been in place since the 1700s, and it was a family-owned winery, and we had a wonderful evening where we sat down and we sampled. I think there was about 4 or 5 different kinds of wines, and they told us all about how the wine was made and you know what constituted a good wine versus a bad wine, and they even had a situation where they took some wine and distilled it, and they double distilled it, and they created this liquor, or this. It was more like a bourbon, I guess. But one of my friends brought a bottle home.
Oh, did?
And it's supposed to be really good stuff.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Now, do they use the old techniques or new technique? You know, you go to the wineries now; they got the stainless steel tanks. Or they use the old wooden barrels, or how do they process their wines?
Well, they have the old wooden barrels from the 1800s, but they don't use them anymore.
Oh, they don't.
They just switched over to all stainless steel.
Yeah, typical. Okay.
And we asked the questions also about cork. You know, corks in the bottles, and now they're going to the twist-offs, because the twist-offs seem to seal better. They said, first of all, the corks deteriorate over time,
right?
And secondly, they became very, very expensive. So now they're going to twist-offs, and they say they're just as good.
Yeah, the synthetic ones. Yeah, you see that in most wine bottles now. Because I was in Morocco, they had the cork trees there where they actually had probably made the corks from the winery. But like you say, it's very costly.
One of the interesting cities that we went by was a city called Peaceport. Well, if you hear the term Peaceport, you think of wine, right?
I've heard of that.
There's a story behind this Peaceport, the city of Peaceport. Back in the day, back in the early times, the church used to get 10% of the take. So every winery would have to give the church 10%
of the wine
of their wine. And in this town, Peaceport, what happened was all the farmers used to give the priest the worst wine they had. So he made a declaration that they could only grow Peaceport grapes in this particular town, so that he ensured that he got reasonable wine.
Wonderful.
And needless to say, they had a great cathedral there, like most of the cities in Germany. Then we cycled toward this town called Trier. Now Trier was a really interesting city because it was really a part of the Roman Empire. And as part of the Roman Empire, this became like one of their sub-capitals. And it was a really interesting city because it still had the old stadium there.
From the Roman days.
The Roman days. So this stadium was over 2,000 years old. Now, there was a couple of issues. The first problem was that the stadium existed and the whole arena was still there. But the seating, which typically held 18,000 people, all of the stones had been removed from that part of the structure. And the reason they were removed is that the Catholic Church came in, they saw all of this cut stone, and they wanted to build a monastery. So guess where they got their stones from? They got it from the Roman Colosseum. But there's still a lot of the Colosseum that still remains. Well, this had an amphitheater, it had community baths, it had huge churches. I mean, the town of Trier was really interesting, really interesting town. They had a huge square. They have a big market there in the middle of the square. They have old architecture. They have a huge Catholic church. Yeah, there's a lot of you know, like I say, there's a lot of history in Trier. They say that you can get 2,000 years of history by taking 2,000 steps.
Is that right?
Yeah. But it was a walled community, and it included the largest city gate in the world. and it's called the Porta Nigra, or Black Gate.
Black Gate.
And the city was obviously a walled city at the time.
Right.
And there's not much of the wall left today. But on Wednesday, we cycled to SAR Berg, when you could do either a 9 or a 21-mile ride. You had your choice. And we stayed the morning. We stayed the morning in Trier, but we had to get to the barge at a certain location, and rather than biking there, we actually took a train, one of the German trains.
Where'd they load the bicycles? I guess you had the trailing guy with the
The
van?
bikes actually were on the barge.
They were, okay,
Yeah.
but I mean on this trip here you went on.
So, but we were kind of touring to Trier, and they said, okay, now at a certain time you got to get on the train,
Right.
And you go to you got to train to the next town. And I hadn't ridden on a European train in a long time. So I was amazed that there were no the rails were continuous rails. There were no buttings of the rails together like there are in the United States. They're a single rail, and there is no clickety clack as you're driving, as you're riding along in the train. They're all seamless, and it was a smooth, really smooth ride. So their technology for trains is just
way above ours.
It's really good. So anyway, we took the ride, and we arrived in SAR Berg. And SAR Berg is a beautiful city. It has a 65-foot waterfall right in the middle of the city.
Oh.
And it's surrounded by, restaurants and fine stores and that type of thing. So we found a restaurant close by and had, dinner there.
Or lunch? I mean, is this where you had lunch each time? You bicycle every day that you stopped for your lunch on your own, or?
Most of the lunches were on your own.
Yes, okay.
But some were on the barge, depending upon where we were on that particular day. Thursday, we went to Kohn's and Wasserbilling and Nittel, Nittel, and we ended up in a Remisch. And you could bike that one. It's either 20 or 33 miles, so you had your choice. But one of the things we did the first thing in the morning was we visited a bell factory.
A bell?
Yeah, where they make bells, church bells.
Church bells.
And I'm talking bells, the size of this table that we have in front of us. And they stopped actually making bells in 2002, but they had made bells for a lot of the very big cathedrals around Europe. And we had a great tour guide. I think he was probably part owner of the place, but told us all about bell making and about how they designed the bell. And most of the design is in the designer's head.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh.
And they don't let out their secrets.
Oh.
So when these designers die, their secrets go with them.
They're gone.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
did you actually see the pouring of some of these bells, or not?
No. It showed where they were poured. It showed how the molds were made, and it showed the design. And he demonstrated the difference between using a hammer on the bell like you would use on a clock versus the
whatever's in the middle of the bell. I can't think of what it is.
Clapper.
Clapper. There you go. Right. Yes,
right.
Clapper.
So anyway, he demonstrated that and showed us the foundry where
poured the material.
stuff was cast, which was really interesting. And every pouring, before they did a pouring, they had a statue located above it, which is a religious statue that they prayed to before they poured the bell.
That's significant.
It was a custom that they had. So anyway, we cycled along the river there, and most of our biking was along the Mosel River, so it was pretty hard to get lost.
I was going to ask you, have to compete with traffic or such, but these were bicycle paths in most cases then.
Yeah, and I got to say that the bike paths in Germany are absolutely fantastic.
Oh no.
They're like their Autobahns. One of the lunches we had was on our 40-mile ride. We stopped at this little town on the way back. Vermont Biking had set up a luncheon for us at this guy's restaurant.
Oh.
And the guy's restaurant was basically an old barn that had been created, converted into a restaurant. And he cooked outside. We had tables outside and in the shade, and he cooked outside for us on the grill.
Cooked outside right there?
Yeah. So we had great lunch. So that was really good. But the Bell Foundry was really interesting. But one of the other things that we did is we took a side trip to this little town called Nittel, Nittel, which again was part of the Roman Empire. But the thing that we saw there was incredible. About 30 years ago, some farmer was digging in his field and found some kind of rocky material.
Right.
And as he dug further and further, he discovered that there was a giant, huge mural that was made by stone by the Romans back in the year whatever. And this thing was the size, almost the size of a basketball court.
Okay.
And it had all kinds of designs on it. It had warriors fighting each other, the gladiators fighting each other. It had gladiators fighting against tigers.
Tigers and lions.
And lions and all that stuff. And it was just an incredible sight. But they now have it covered with a building, and you can walk around the kind of a ledge and look at it. But it was unbelievable, great condition. It was just like it was built yesterday. But then we got back to the barge, and it was time to have a beer tasting party. So our two guides, who by the way were absolutely fantastic, had gone out and bought all these different kinds of beers.
Right.
So we got back to the barge and we had a nice beer tasting party. And one of our guys, Mark Bedard, happened to be his birthday.
Oh my!
So we had a little birthday party, a beer tasting party on board the barge, which was just fantastic.
I don't know, birthday cake and beer would go together.
Well,
it's okay. Later,
yeah,
right?
The cake was later.
Later, right?
But anyway, then the next day on Friday, we biked to this little town called Rodemack. And this is actually now, this time, we're actually in France by this time.
Now.
So the town is supposed to be one of the most beautiful cities in France. And it's an old city that was surrounded by high walls. It was a walled community back in the, but it was absolutely fantastic. And Bike Vermont put out a picnic for us when we got there. So we had a beautiful picnic in the center of this town near a fountain, which was
Sounds like they did a fabulous job of setting this all up. Then it was just wonderful.
Everything was like clockwork. I mean, they knew. These two tour guides had done this tour 40 times before.
Okay, so they probably had it down pat.
They knew everything. They knew everything. They knew where everybody was going to go off course. They knew, So it was really well done. But we ended up taking the barge to another city called Metz, M-E-T-Z. It's pronounced Metz.
Oh, Metz?
Metz, which is not far from Luxembourg. And we spent a day kind of touring around there. And it was kind of interesting. This whole area had been obviously involved in the wars. And one of the things we did do on one of our rides was we ran across some bunkers from the old Maginot Line.
Oh, Maginot Line? Oh,
yeah.
Yes. That'd be interesting.
Yeah. And so we had a chance to kind of view that. But Metz was a city that was a French city, and the Germans came in and they wanted some space from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church says no. So they said, okay, we'll build our own church. So they built their own church in the town. And of course, at that time, the steeple had to be higher than the Catholic Church. So as you're going into town, you see this huge big steeple, but there's no church behind it. It's just the steeple. The church had been burned out a few years ago. So then you see the Catholic Church, and it's unbelievable.
Good.
But we just had an opportunity to tour through that city, and that was the only day that we had rain on our whole trip. And so we had a fantastic week weather-wise. So, but anyway, so we breakfast on the barge. We toured the city, and we had a local tour guide that took us through
around the city.
and we went to the cathedral, which is a cathedral of Saint Etienne, and it has these huge stained glass windows, which like most of them do.
Churches have in Europe.
But this one has something different. The couple of the church windows were modern windows, and they were made by Marc Chagall.
Oh, Chagall?
Yeah.
Yes.
So here we are. We've got these modern windows by Chagall, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. The next day we get shuttled to Luxembourg City. But on the way to Luxembourg City, we had a chance to stop at the American Cemetery for World War II.
Oh, those are fabulous.
In Luxembourg. And there were 5,076 U.S. soldiers buried in that cemetery. In addition to that, General Patton is buried there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So he's got his own he's got his own marker there, which we saw.
Well, there was something unique about that, because I was in the one in France at Omaha and Utah Beach.
Right.
There's something like 9,376 soldiers there, but understand, if you wanted your son to be brought back to the States, they would intern your body and bring it back to the States. Only 36% of where the crosses are now have bodies. The rest have been either come back to the United States.
Really?
Yes, you can request the government to bring your remains back, and that's what they've done. A lot of the families, but a lot of them left them there also.
Really?
But they're so unbelievable, those cemeteries. They're so well kept and everything. And
oh,
they're beautiful. I mean, it gives you, you feel a spine up and down your back, like it just, it's so unbelievable. I don't know if you felt the same way, being patriotic.
Yeah, yeah, they have a chapel there, and they have some huge murals which describe the movement of the various armies during the Second World War.
Okay.
Of course, the Battle of the Bulge took place not far away from there. So that was a huge battle there. So anyway, then we go to Luxembourg City, and again, Vermont Biking had set us up with a hotel, and the hotel, I got to say, was at least a 4-star, maybe a 5-star hotel.
Yeah, they're always good.
It was unbelievable. Luxembourg has a lot of great hotels, but this was fabulous.
Fabulous.
And we spent a couple of days in Luxembourg, just relaxing and having a good time touring around. First night we went out to dinner, and we everywhere you go, it's just a beautiful city. We saw some, there's a huge statue of a lady sitting on top of this thing with a big ring, and I've forgotten what it represents, but anyway, it represents Luxembourg. But they also had a beautiful park right behind our hotel, basically. And it was acres of just flowers and fountains and all kinds of good stuff.
Relaxing and enjoyable. Yeah,
really good.
Well, we certainly like to thank you, George. Certainly we could probably talk for hours on this subject, because I love Europe, and so thanks again for coming today and sharing your traveling experience. I think it's a wonderful thing, and for us in active living, join us for the next edition, and just keep the words going. Keep traveling, right?
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it.
All right.